they needed a cloud-based solution, and Salesforce offered one for free. So I said, hey, can I implement this as part of what I'm doing for you all? And it was wonderful because every time a new need came up there at the nonprofit, I went to Dreamforce and saw that Salesforce was doing that. It was part of the next release. I'm like, you people are great. You're figuring out exactly what I need right before I need it. This is awesome.
That is Bonny Hinners, a senior member of technical staff here at Salesforce. I'm Josh Burke, your host of the Salesforce Developer Podcast. And here on the podcast, you'll hear stories and insights from developers for developers. Today, we sit down and talk with Bonny about, well, honestly, our shared love for test-driven development, what it is, how you can utilize it, and how it can improve your developer experience. Now, after many years in the community, after being introduced to Salesforce with her work on a nonprofit, Bonny is now here working at Salesforce. And so we start by asking her about her current job.
My current job is awesome. That's how I would describe it. I work for one of the teams that builds tools on the Salesforce platform for the developers of the Salesforce platform. So it's kind of Inception in that way.
because you're using the platform to help the engineers build the platform so that you can help build tools to help them build the platform?
You got it.
Nice.
And because we are, my team works in conjunction with the Agile coaches here. Mm-hmm. So we're very interested in process and improvements and experimentation and all kinds of fun things. So we do test-driven development. We do mob development. It's very fun.
So that would be a good segue into the topic we've chosen for today. But I've got two questions first. First of all, mob development. Tell me more.
Oh, mob development. We actually get onto video conference for hours and hours in the day, and 3 or more of us will sit down with the code and decide what to do next. So in mob development, there's usually a navigator and a driver. The driver is the person with the keyboard, and the navigator is the person being thoughtful. And everybody else is contributing ideas or looking up reference materials or just waiting for their turn, perhaps, if they're, just fully in agreement with what's happening. And so, yeah, it's pretty fun. You limit the amount of time that any person spends in any role. But hey, we don't really spend a lot of time in those cycles of I've produced some code and now I need somebody to do technical review on it. And nobody wants to do it because I did something complicated. and now I'm off doing something else. And they're building their code and they don't really want to take time away from that because they're on that same 2-week deadline that I was on.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. So it's kind of like a organic, productive version of a technical code review.
Except we still do all the processes. We still get to a code review and we still make changes in our code review. We're like, maybe we should have done this differently. Or, oh, hey, there's that thing we forgot to take out or put in, or,
Got it.
Nice. Let's capitalize the first letter of that comment. It all is possible still, but we kind of all do it together because we're a reasonably small group. It's pretty easy to do that. And we're also a new team, completely new, all new this year, but our code is old. So we've adopted code that had been managed by multiple teams prior to us coming on board.
Got it.
So it's great because we're all learning about this code base together. We're kind of preventing the silos as a result. Yeah, there shouldn't be any one developer who knows more about any part of the code base than anybody else.
Yes. I always, when I was a development lead, I always told them that, I was trying to develop myself into obsolescence. And if I was I hate to use this analogy because it's kind of gory, but it's like if I got hit by a bus that day, they should be able to complete the project without me. So I appreciate the not having the one person who knows, those 3 classes and without them, you can't get anywhere. So I want to segue that into test-driven development, but I always like to give a shout out to Rad Women whenever I can. How did you get involved with that?
Well, let's see. Back when they first were getting started and prepping for their very first round of coaching, I knew the folks who were putting the program together, and they were reaching out to women that they knew that were programming on the platform. And I was fortunate enough to be asked to participate. And at first I was skeptical because I've always worked with a lot of men, and I thought, I'm not sure if I even know that this is needed, but hey, I'll give it a try because why not?
Right.
I mean, yes is always the best answer, maybe. and so I joined even with that bit of skepticism, and even with that bit of skepticism in my brain at the time. And it was the best experience ever to get to meet a lot of women who are technically excellent. All of the other coaches that I met and got the opportunity to work with because we co-coach. And then all these women who are coming up as advanced admins who are interested in learning how to communicate better with developers, how to develop a little bit themselves, how to help troubleshoot when issues come up. It's just a really wonderful community of people and ideas.
Nice. Yeah, no, they do amazing work, and I'm always happy to try to give a little pointer over to them whenever possible.
And I was just going to point out that as a coach, I get to influence the way people think about programming. And I do take advantage of that to promote test-driven development to all of the folks that I interact with, because it's a very life-changing kind of approach to development. And particularly for new developers, if you can get that new habit from the beginning, I think it's really helpful. With the Rad Women learners, often they're faced with this blank page syndrome. It's the same thing that writers get. And, when you were working on papers as an English major, you might remember that. I have to fill out all these pages, and I know that I want to finish product that's something like that, but where do I start?
Right.
If you're using test-driven development, it's super easy to figure out where you start. You take one of your acceptance criteria. Hopefully it's written in a given when-then format, given some user, some piece of data, some scenario set up. When this thing happens, they push a button, some new data comes in, then the expected output is this. Something gets saved to the database, something gets changed in the database, whatever that result might be. So, hey, that sounds like a test.
Sounds like a test. Yes.
If we're not thinking about unit tests, let's dismiss the idea of unit tests, which I think is a myth on the Salesforce platform anyway, for the most part, because, there's 20 things that happen when you save a record into the database or update it. 20 things. How do you get to one unit of that without touching all the other units if you're actually interacting with the database?
Well,
to do a unit test, you do the mocks, you avoid touching the database, you do everything, you work really hard to isolate things. But then how do you know that your system meets the business need? Because you've isolated everything so much. Is there some flaw that happens when all the things interact, when all the steps come together? So,
yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for the segue. That was brilliant. And also, I definitely appreciate the whole blank page, aspect, especially to people who are coming in new to the platform, because I think, the kind of coding that I had done prior to Salesforce we had test scripts and stuff but I don't think the concept of actual like unit testing and code coverage had really been forced on me in the way that Apex forced it on me as a developer. And that's, I kind of had that initiation like a lot of developers did. It's like, oh, well, Salesforce is forcing me to have, 75% code coverage. So suddenly that became, the goal. The goal was have this thing have code coverage. And as people have learned, for instance, code coverage is not the greatest metric of how well you're testing. And then I had that like kind of aha moment myself of like, oh, wait, with test-driven development, I'm not catching up with the code and trying to figure out how it's flawed. I'm starting with the problem that the code should be trying to kind of like solve kind of thing. So, but first let's take a step back. What would be your elevator pitch? Like, what's your short description of what test-driven development is?
Oh, that's a tough one. Elevator pitch. I don't know if I can give you an elevator pitch, but
okay,
I can tell you my story about why I chose that as my preferred method of development.
Okay.
Like you, I started on the platform and went, oh my gosh, I have to write tests. What does that even mean? Because
right.
I had written in Pascal and BASIC and assembly language, and those I didn't need tests. I ran it. If it worked, it worked.
Right.
And so that was a new concept for me when I started programming in Apex. And it was always hard because I took the approach that I had learned in my previous jobs and in college and in high school. And that was, you write the code that does the stuff and you see that it compiles first. Mm-hmm. And if you got past that, right, then if it runs pretty well, you're fine. And this was a new concept. It was write all that and then go back and prove that the things that you wanted to achieve got achieved. And to me, that was hard because I wanted to get the code coverage. I wanted to prove that my code did what I wanted it to do, but I wrote my code wrong to make it. Yeah, testing was hard. It was a hard thing to accomplish. And then I went to a Dreamforce session that was like 15 minutes long. And I swear, they just stood up there and pretty much said, yeah, test-driven development. You come up with the test, you write it so that it fails, and then you write the code that makes it pass. And then you run it again, and voila, you're done. And you just keep doing that over and over again. And they did a better job of selling it than that. But that's the crux of it. And it was only 15 minutes. And I went up to them afterwards and kind of asked the stupid question of, wait, there's more, right? Like, then what? It's like, no, really, it's just you write the test that fails. You write the code that makes it work. Right. And then you move on to do the next part of your code. What does it need to accomplish? You write that test. And I was just like, okay, I think I can get my head around this. And walking out, one of the other audience members said, well, that was life-changing.
Right.
And we were both like, yes, it actually was, because now I need to figure out how to do this. Yeah. And luckily, I then started working at United Health Group. And their development strategy is acceptance test-driven development. And that's when it all fell into place for me. I was like, now I totally get it, because I can put my Agile processes together with my development processes. And I can actually figure out how to write code that's actually testable. Mm-hmm. And that actually serves as documentation for what the heck my code is supposed to be doing. So
right. Well, so let's take a step back again, because when I was kind of poking around for source material for this, it was very difficult for me to find the proper distinction between simply test-driven development and acceptance development, or test-driven development. So what is the distinction there? And maybe tell me a little bit more about how that hooks into the Agile methods.
Okay, that's a good question. Let me see. So how would I differentiate acceptance test-driven development from simply test-driven development? I guess with test-driven development, if you don't take the approach of acceptance test-driven development, with test-driven development, you're kind of open to, I could start with anything first.
Mm-hmm.
And that puts you in the mind frame. It would put me again in the mind frame of, well, what do I want my code to do first? And so then I'm circling back around that blank page a little bit. Mm-hmm. Whereas if I start with acceptance criteria, mm-hmm. and if I've got convinced my team to write acceptance criteria in a given when-then format, then I have everything I need to write a test. I have the scenario, the data, and the user that I need to be able to do the test setup. And I have that's the given portion of my given mm-hmm. when-then. And I have the then portion, so that's going to be my system assertion. Okay. And that's going to fail when I write that test because there's nothing in the middle. There has been no when happening. Okay. So now I need to figure out, well, what does my code need to do to satisfy the when? And if you are fortunate to get, small enough and discrete enough acceptance criteria, then you get a nice suite of tests. But those aren't all the tests, right? I still mm-hmm. might be doing something really tricky with the Apex code that, maybe it's using a new method that is part of Apex now that wasn't part of Apex previously, and maybe I'm not that familiar with it, or maybe it's just something complex that I haven't tried before, mm-hmm. and I want to make sure it works. Well, I'm going to code that in a small block as possible so that I can actually test it. It's the same way, actually, I apply this to learning how to take advantage of new features in Apex. If I can write a test to demonstrate for myself what it does, what it doesn't do, even understanding the platform in general, mm-hmm. Understanding where am I going to hit limits, for example. Well, if I write a test that mm-hmm. pushes the limits, then I can better understand how limits work.
Right.
So now every time I sit down to code, I sit down to write a test.
Interesting.
And then I go from the test. If I have a test that does something interesting, I can grab the interesting part and shove it into a method separate from my test.
Right. That's an interesting twist, I feel like, because when I was first getting kind of into the religion of TDD, like really kind of, embracing it, I think the first way it was sort of described to me was you can start with your user stories, you convert your user stories into test-based scenarios, and then you build the code up in order to make those stories generally work. But the way you're describing it is actually does not need to be attached to like a user persona or a customer story or, person X is going to try to do X, Y, and Z. It's more flexible than that. And like, in some sense, you could be the user who is doing the acceptance testing.
Well, sure. Because, there is still a place for unit testing, and there are still parts of the code that I write that I need to verify do the thing that I thought they did, So mm-hmm. there's three ways that an application can have a bug. There's probably mm-hmm. more than that, but
there's at least three.
But the three basic ways are there's a problem with the user story. It didn't mm-hmm. describe a scenario, an edge case, mm-hmm. and therefore the code doesn't accommodate that edge case. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that's a bug. You fix it because somebody says, this happens when I do this, and you go, wow, I never knew you were going to do that. Okay, now I know. What did you want it to do there? Okay, I can make that happen. And you fix that. You write the test that shows that, in fact, when they do that thing, they get the result that you thought they wanted because you didn't know this happened. And now you have a new result, so we're going to put that into our new test, see it fail, write the code that makes it work, and voila, all of a sudden refactoring and bug fixing is super easy because we're reproducing our bugs with our test-driven development approach. Mm-hmm. And then another way that they fail, not just the user story being wrong, but the test is wrong. So another way that code is buggy is that you've written the wrong test, right? And that usually, hopefully with test-driven development especially, gets caught before the code gets released, because you start writing a test a certain way, and then you realize that you're testing the wrong thing. You're just looking at the wrong thing.
Right.
So my example of this in the real world is the San Diego Zoo. They have a campaign to benefit rhinoceros as an endangered species. And their campaign is Save the Chubby Unicorn, because some of the rhinos have only one horn. The greater one-horned rhino, I think it is, has only one
Gotcha.
horn. So awesome. Okay. Save the Chubby Unicorn.
Right.
And someone gave me a present that was an ornament that is from the San Diego Zoo and has printed on the side, Save the Chubby Rhino. And I'm like, that was really excellent quality assurance. Somebody looked at that rhinoceros-shaped
and
ornament.
They're like, that's a rhino. That's a rhino. A equals A.
Our test says if it's an animal, then the label should be the name of the animal. We're changing this. They didn't know. I mean, this was they were testing the wrong thing. They wanted to test: is it chubby? Is it part of a campaign? Is it there was some other test that needed to go in there.
And I just got to say that some poor marketing / creative person must have just been so sad, because Chubby Unicorn's clever. It's like, that's good marketing. And to pull that from somebody's, solid. Yeah.
So you want to make sure that you're testing the right thing.
Right things. Yeah. Well, and I've got to go into your first layer, are you representing, what the user wants / will do? Back in my front-end development days, it was the days of pop-up windows. Like anything you needed to do, kind of from if you wanted to zoom in on a product or just look at the product image, everything was a pop-up window. And it was always this, we kept getting all this, the windows never behaved the way anybody wanted them to, right? Like they would be behind the browser, in front of the browser. They'd open in a tab, and they just misbehaving windows was just this constant source of feedback. So me and the designer, we got together and we designed the most beautiful in the page itself modal window that worked every possible way we could think of. Like you click off of it, it disappears. Like everything we thought the user was going to do, it responded correctly. And we patted ourselves on the back and we launched that and we got rid of all the pop-up windows. And then we got a flood of feedback from people asking us why we removed the comparison feature. And the designer and I are like, what are you talking about? There is no comparison. And then we realized people were opening a pop-up window in one product, going to another product page, hitting that, opening up another pop-up window, and then putting those two windows side by side. And we had no idea that user behavior existed until we took it away from them.
Wow.
And then we got a flood of people that are like, why did you take this away from us? So then what we did was the right thing, which was to actually put in a proper, comparison feature that actually worked within the website, as intended. But I think it's kind of nice how test-driven development can be paved on good intentions, but then can also be improved on and refactored again in good intentions, right? Like the problem there is just update what your acceptance test should look like.
Absolutely. Yeah. And testing and retesting and applying that to your whole debugging process helps you get better stories. It helps you get a better construction to your program in the first place, because you're thinking about these bite-sized portions that need to do these smallish jobs that are a portion of the bigger job, so that you can move stepwise through what you're trying to accomplish. Yeah.
And I think it's good to highlight that, because in a recent interview, somebody also pointed out that if you have these kind of small unit design tests, you're probably also going to have the smallest footprint of code, right? Like you're kind of this kind of feels like a way to trick developers into doing Agile, I got to say.
It shouldn't be a trick. Having worked in the magazine industry, I have to say that Agile makes so much sense because we were putting out monthly magazines. Mm-hmm. And my cycle was to spend for one magazine, I was running their test lab. So I would spend 4 weeks per issue. Mm-hmm. But during that 4 weeks, I'm trying to receive product that I can test. So I'm reaching out to all these companies, asking them for all my future plans. So I know what my roadmap is, right? I have a roadmap defined. Right. And I'm gaining knowledge, if you will, to help me achieve that portion of the roadmap once I get there. Mm-hmm. And I know what I'm doing for this issue. So I'm writing that. I'm sending that to an editor who will review it and make changes or suggest changes. And then somebody else will package it all up and send it to the publisher, right. And it's released. Oh my gosh. Yeah. It's just like doing software. Yeah. And especially software in an Agile process where you're working on specific deadlines. You know what you've got to get done for this issue, if you will. And you know when it's due. You know that it's going to be reviewed by somebody else. You know it's going to be put together by the release manager at a certain point in time. Right. You've got to meet those deadlines. So got to say, I love Agile too.
Well, I think Agile is sort of interesting because I think some people shy away from it because feels like there's a lot of weight and process and dogma kind of associated with it. But my experience has been there's not necessarily Agile done right so much as Agile done right for you. Like, what is the process that meets what you just described, which is how do we get this monthly magazine out every single month in a way that is going to be acceptance-driven, process-driven, but also do we have to do everything that's in the Agile workbook kind of thing?
Yeah, exactly. I think, sadly, there is dogma applied sometimes, but the thing is, Agile's a methodology, so it suggests using Scrum and Scrum ceremonies, and it suggests, avoiding documentation. Who doesn't like that? So we don't have specs anymore. Right. As a result, I remember early days in the industry, we worked from specs, and I don't know who put the specs together that I was working from. Those usually landed in my lap, and I was, given some portion of that spec to make happen. And so we said, gee, those specs take a long time to produce. Can't we just write the code instead? And so that's what we've been doing, thanks to Agile. Nice. I think that is one of the great benefits of it, is that it eliminated the need to put together a document that details how things are going to be done. And in the time that you create that document, the requirements change.
Right. Right. Well, so shifting gears just slightly, you also have a Pluralsight course with the great Don Robbins, talking about test tips and test development, but for admins, right? Is there stuff from that course that you think, and I know that this, like, we can do like our high level hot tips kind of thing, but are there things from that course that might be useful for developers?
I think that I wanted to do that course primarily because creating the data to set up the scenario is one of the hardest things for developers because of those 20 things that happen when you save a record in the database. Right. And I actually worked with a company where we got a new junior admin who came in very gung-ho and ready to make improvements, doing a great job, and ready to watch all the things. And she said, that vendor who's writing code for us and putting code in, they've done something wrong because our code coverage is down to 50%. And I thought, well, that's crazy because I'm the one reviewing their code. Yeah. And that can't be. So I looked at the number, and when I looked at it, it was 0%. And I went, well, that can't be, because nobody's even released anything between her coming up with a number and me coming up with a number. So let me look at some of these errors. And the new admin had put in validation rules for phone numbers that required parentheses. There is apparently not a developer in the world who puts test data together with parentheses in the phone number.
I mean, in our defense, it's 2 whole more characters that I just don't really need.
Exactly. So every single test failed at the point of setting up the data. And so luckily I was able to point out the Salesforce formula best practices guides, which have examples of how to do a good validation rule for phone numbers.
For both whole formats.
Yeah. And we changed the validation rules, got things working again.
Got your code coverage back.
But it made me think, how do we get admins and developers working more closely together?
Yeah.
Because they're both serving the same end users ultimately. They've both got the same goal ultimately. And developers don't need to know about data really. I don't know. Maybe I'm alone in that thought, but when I'm wearing my developer hat, data is the last thing I want to have to think about. Even when I'm writing integrations, honestly. But when I'm wearing my admin hat, I know that I'm thinking about data all the time.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And it's interesting because some of the stuff we've had on the show has been like, how do you mock your data? And we're probably by the time this airs, I think we'll have aired the Snowflake Create data generator. And it's like, they just want the data to be there. Just be there and let me just use it and not have to worry about it that much.
Right. And so a developer's point of view on data is it can be anything. And as long as it fills in the blanks. And then they run into things like, well, somebody wanted you to put parentheses around your phone numbers or keep the values within this range for this type of data and within that range for that type of data. And you've got a mismatch. That's hard. So what if we could give a way for the admins to create the data that the developer uses in the test? And we have test load data as a function that will actually load a CSV file. And I think it's kind of awesome. It does have some limitations, so I'm hoping someday it will be built out in a more robust fashion to support, say, multiple relationships between records more easily, for example. That's kind of what I go into in the Pluralsight course is how do we introduce the idea to admins that they can be responsible for the test data and they can keep it up to date, make sure it matches validation rules. They can now run tests that verify their auto-launched flows and things like that. I did a presentation at Dreamforce about using that technique to test flows, for example.
Got it. Nice. Well, and I just love the idea of a validation rule breaking everything is kind of the story as old as Salesforce itself, I feel like.
It is, and it's one of those 20 steps, right? We want all 20 steps to be able to coexist and get us from that given through the when all the way to the then. We want all of those things to come out at the end. And that's how we know that our users are getting what they asked for and what they needed.
And that's our show. Now, before we go, I did ask after Bonnie's favorite non-technical hobby, and I have to tell you, this one's a first.
Trapeze.
Trapeze?
I do static trapeze for fun. I'm really terrible at it, and I have a very patient coach who enjoys trying to teach me how to do it. Enjoys the challenge of trying to teach me how to be better at the things I'm trying to do.
I want to thank Bonnie for the great conversation and information. And as always, I want to thank you for listening. Now, if you want to learn more about this show, head on over to developer.salesforce.com/podcast, where you can hear old episodes, see the show notes, and have links to your favorite podcast service. Thanks again, everybody. And I'll talk to you next week.